The Spectre of Globalization, on the Form and Content of the World Market, by Werner Bonefeld. Introduction. Only a few years ago, capitalist development was analyzed in terms of nationally based strategies, such as Thatcherism or Reaganism. Their successors in office have not been granted an ism. Instead, the focus of analysis falls on globalization. Globalization is perceived as an all-pervasive force in the modern world that forces national states to accommodate to global pressure at the risk of being left behind. National states and workers alike are judged to be virtually powerless to withstand the globalized power of capital. The precise meaning and significance of globalization continues to be disputed. It is, however, generally assumed that the idea of a cohesive national economy in domestic society no longer holds. That we witness the creation of a truly global economy in society, and that everyday life has become dependent on global forces. The defining elements of globalization are many, and can be summarized as follows. The emergence of a global financial structure is seen to have led to the dominance of finance over production, and undermined national systems of financial regulation. Finance capital is seen to have become an independent and powerful global force in its own right. Then, there is the emergence of global oligopolies in the form of multinational companies and transnational banks. These are seen to have become the most powerful actors. The global operation of multinational companies and finance capital is said to lead to a borderless world. Globalization, in short, is seen to have severely weakened the regulative ability of the national state, and the economy is seen to have denationalized itself, leading to the transformation of the national state into a competition state. The state is seen to be subjected to the demands and requirements of an economy beyond its reach. As a consequence, national states are seen to be competing with each other to achieve comparative advantages, to control globally footloose capital to their shores, and to retain it there. In short, the competition state is perceived in terms of a hyper-liberal state that seeks to make its territory ready for capital investment regardless of the social consequences. Supported by an array of empirical evidence, critics of globalization charge, for example, that multinational companies are not as footloose as the proponents of globalization assume, and that the national state remains significant as a regulative power, and that we witness a regionalization rather than a globalization of the world economy. For the critics, an internationally anchored national political strategy to regulate the economy remains a certain possibility. The crucial difference, then, between proponents and critics of globalization rests on their conception of the ability of the state to regulate the economy, with the proponents arguing that the state has been rendered powerless, and the critics claiming that it remains a potentially powerful force. What, then, is the relationship between the state and the economy? Cox's view is of interest here. He argues that the state has become a transmission belt from the global to the national economy, where, heretofore, before the onslaught of globalization, it has acted as the bulwark, defending domestic welfare from external disturbances. For Cox, the state has since the onset of the capitalist crisis in the early 1970s responded to external economic pressure through institutional restructuring, leading to a greater role of the more market-oriented state apparatuses, like the Treasury, to the detriment of those concerned with social welfare and employment. This is seen to have precipitated a new form of consensus formation between the market-oriented state apparatuses and non-governmental institutions such as the IMF. In Cox's account, the state is actively involved in adjusting the national economy to global capital demands and regulative requirements. Panitch and Hirsch go one step further than Cox by suggesting that globalization has been authored by states in an attempt to set the economy free from Keynesian regulative restrictions. Globalization is thus seen as a neoliberal political project. The two sides of the debate on globalization are, despite their differences, distinctive only as a variance of a common theme. According to Burnham, both sides see the relationship between the state and the economy in terms of two distinct entities of social organization. The globalizationists argue that the economy that determines the political, and critics that it is the economy that determines the political, and the critics charge that the state remains capable of regulating the economy. The question then is that of the relative autonomy of either the political or the economic. Should it be accorded to the economy, or does it remain, at least potentially, with the state? David Held puts the view of the proponents of globalization well. For him, globalization implies a distinctively new international order involving the emergence of a global economic system which stretches beyond the control of a single state, even of dominant states. The expansion of networks of transnational linkages and communications over the particular states have had little influence. The enormous growth of international organizations, which can limit the scope for action of the most powerful states, the development of a global military order, which can reduce the range of policies available to governments and their citizens. Off echoes this view by claiming that a left project of an active, preventative state, providing a positive, coordinated policy, has evidently exhausted itself. Anderson reinforces these views when he argues that the new reality is a massive asymmetry between the international mobility, an organization of capital, and a dispersal and fragmentation of labor that has no historical precedent. The globalization of capitalism has not drawn resistances to it together, but scattered and outflanked them. The future belongs to the set of forces that are overtaking the nation-state. So far, they have been captured or driven by capital, as in the last 50 years. Internationalism has changed sides. So long as the left fails to win back the initiative here, the current system will be secure. Internationalism, then, has outwitted the left, whose project of a national democratic regulation of the economy that apparently was appropriate in the past is no longer viable. In order, then, to recoup the terrain lost to democracy, democracy has to become a transnational affair. For the critics, national strategies and internationality coordinate responses to globalization are still possible. All depend on the development of governance mechanisms. Others argue that the left has to reorient strategic discussions towards a transformation of the state. This transformation is endorsed in terms of a return to a democratically grounded domestic Keynesianism, so as to achieve a radical redistribution of productive resources, income, and working time. The demand then is either for a shift towards a more inwardly oriented economy, or an international Keynesian authority through which national strategies of economic regulation are anchored. In sum, the argument in the debate on globalization is whether capital has escaped the state irretrievably, or whether the state is able to regain regulative control over capital. What, however, is to be understood by capital? In the debate on globalization, capital is at worst perceived as a thing that now exists globally, and the global is perceived as capital, whose economic mechanism has somewhat become dysfunctional concerning social needs because it cannot be regulated politically according to democratic principles. At best, the global capital relation is perceived in terms of capitalist competition. According to Cox, the competitive logic of capital on a world scale entails the subordination of domestic economies to the perceived exigencies of a global economy. States willy-nilly become more effective, accountable to a nebulous personified as the global economy, and they were constrained to mystify this external accountability in the eyes and ears of their own publics, through the new vocabulary of globalization, interdependence, and competitiveness. Cox's view is of interest for three reasons. First, globalization is seen as a jargon employed to depoliticize the making of national economic policy. Second, global relations of trade, production, and finance are perceived as constituting a global economy. And finally, this economy is characterized as something invisible, a nebulous to which national states are accountable. This last point echoes Adam Smith's understanding of the market mechanism as something governed by an invisible hand. Cox's view has much to commend it, especially his conception of the global economy as a nebulous. However, the shortcoming of Cox's account is that he fails to show the social constitution of this invisible mist. His conception of the global relations of capital is tautological. The answer to the question, what is capital, is already presupposed. Capital is capital, and vice versa. As shown by Gunn, such sort of theoretical refinement amounts to an infinite regress of meta-theories. The eternal quest of political economy to discover the practical meaning of invisible principles ends up as an irrational exercise because what needs to be understood is presupposed as something beyond reason, that is, as something invisible, where economic development really governs by the invisible hand, and understanding of our social world as a world made by humans and dependent upon humans' transformative power would be rendered obsolete. In sum, not only Cox, but the debate on globalization on the whole fails to conceptualize the fundamental relationship between labor and capital. This relationship remains untethered and is replaced by an understanding of capital as a self-relation. In this way, labor can only be understood in terms of the wage of labor, that is, as a laboring commodity. As a consequence, labor as the substance of value is excluded theoretically, and class struggle obtains merely in terms of a domestic working class that is controlled by capital through the threat of moving production to areas that offer more favorable conditions of exploitation. For Marx, the relation of capital to itself, that is, the relation of capital to capital, constitutes the fetishism of capital. He analyzed this in terms of the fetishism of the value form. This chapter argues that Marx's critique of the value form needs to be seen as a critique of the global relations of capital. Cox's view of the world market as a nebulous personified as a global economy serves as a starting point. This chapter does not challenge the notion that the capital relation is a global relation, nor does it dispute the view that the capitalist form of the state implies its function to mobilize those under its jurisdiction to comply with the rule of the market. What the chapter takes issue with is the notion that the state and the economy are two distinct forms of social organization. Globalization is merely seen as the globalization of the economy. What, however, is to be understood by the global? Where does it exist? If the global is extranational, where is its location? Morris' contemporary writings on globalization is premised on the notion of the world market, a notion that is merely taken for granted as a thing whose genesis and constitution remain at best assumed or at worst neglected. The next section introduces Marx's account of the world market. This is followed by an analysis of Marx's critique of fetishism as a critique of the world market. The third section examines the relationship between the world market and the crises. The conclusion summarizes the argument and suggests that the world market is not something extranational and that the national space subsists through the world market. Marx and the world market. Marx never wrote his projected book on the state and the world market. Nevertheless, a cursory reading of his writings and a brief look at various outlines of his work reveal that both the state and the world market are always present. In his outline of 1857, the world market is posed as the final and concluding part of his investigation, coming after the international relation of production and the concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state. Furthermore, the anticipated examination of crises is associated with the projected study of the world market. The theme, then, is the world market in crises. Moreover, following his outline, the world market is conceived to be distinct from the international relations of production. His outline suggests, then, that capitalist crises can be conceptualized adequately only in the global dimension, and that the global relations of capital do not equate with the international relations between states or with relations of so-called economic interdependency. Instead, the outline suggests that the world market is the condition through which relations of economic interdependence subsist. International relations, in short, acquire a livelihood in and through the world market, and the world market suffuses their distinctive existences and relations of competition and interdependency. In short, his outline suggests that the capital relation transcends national states and imposes upon them the condition of their existence, and that is the crisis-ridden development of the capitalist exploitation of labor. For Marx, the projected study of the world market in crises is more than just the final book of his investigation. Rather, it is the conclusion where all contradictions of bourgeois society come into play, and as such manifest themselves in their most concrete materiality. This view is supported by Marx's conceptual argument that, as a rule, the most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to many to all. Then it ceases to be thinkable in a particular form alone. In other words, all and everything subsist not only in relation to the world market, but fundamentally in and through the world market. This view is shared by, for example, Negri and von Braunmühl. who argue that although never fully explained, the world market constitutes for Marx the presupposition and the result of the reproduction of capitalist social relations. Indeed, in his critique of political economy, Marx's investigation into the contradictory mode of existence of capital points time and time again towards the world market as the proper mode of existence and movement of capital relation. As he argues in Volume 3 of Capital, the world market is the basis and the vital element of capitalist production. In short, the world market is the categorical imperative of the political economy of capital. The notion of the world market as the basis of capitalist production raises the question of the distinctive differences between the international relations of interdependency and the world market relations. According to Marx, capital production is unthinkable without foreign trade, and money takes off its national uniform when it reaches the world market. All this seems to suggest that the world market is an international institution that is coterminous with the international state system, which brings together national economies through trade and exchange and divides national economies through economic competition. However, for Marx, such a view is rejected. The relations of industry and trade within every nation are dominated by their intercourse with other nations and are conditioned by relations with the world market. This suggests that the world market is not the sum of many states and their national economies. Rather, it is the foundation upon which international relations between states rest. The world market, then, constitutes the totality of capitalist existence, a totality through which nationally located industry acquires its livelihood as capitalist industry. The world market then becomes the categorical imperative of capitalist production within national borders, between national borders, and beyond national borders. Furthermore, as such an imperative, trade and industry within national borders amount at the same time to trade and industry beyond national borders. The productivity then of the domestic exploitation of labor acquires its livelihood in and through the world market. It is this labor market that suffuses, confirms, and contradicts the domestic exploitation of labor. It is in and through the world market that the domestic exploitation of labor acquires its livelihood as capitalist production. Thus, Marx's insistence that whoever wants to speak about the division of labor has to speak about the world market. The division of labor entails the international division of labor, and the former cannot be conceived without the latter. In other words, the national acquires its livelihood as a territorialization of space, which is sustained by and subsists through the international division of labor. For Marx, the notion of the international division of labor does not depend on Ricardo's idea of comparative advantages. Ricardo's approach assumes the existence of relatively independent national economies and seeks to supply an argument that renders the complexity of the international relations of production coherent and capable of rational organization through schemes of mutually advantageous national specialization of production. Marx's account does not focus on international comparative advantages, but rather on the equalization of the rate of profit on a global scale. This equalization compares the productive labor set to work within industry with the productive labor of all other industries, leading to the determination of an average rate of profit. This average rate of profit obtains as the average world market rate of profit. This equalization and averaging entails the unleashing of a heavy artillery upon national states should the exploitation of labor within their jurisdiction fall below the average world market rate of profit. This heavy artillery impresses itself upon national states through the pressures on the exchange rate, the accumulation of balance of payments, deficits, and drains on national reserves. In other words, the conditions of exploitation impress themselves upon the national state through the movement of money capital. It is through this movement that the global conditions of accumulation impose themselves on national economies. World money is not only a means of exchange or a means of payment, and in case of debt repayment, it obtains fundamentally as a power that polices the effectiveness of the domestic exploitation of labor. The circumstance that the equalization of the rate of profit obtains at the world market means that the domestic productivity of labor is validated in terms of value only in and through the global conditions of exchange. The formation, then, of an average rate of profit transforms the apparent local conditions into conditions of the organic composition of global capital. The existence of the world market then presupposes a very developed totality of real kinds of labor, of which no single one is any longer predominant. This general indifference towards any specific kind of labor means that the category of labor has become, in reality, the means of creating wealth in general, and has ceased to be organically linked with particular individuals in any specific form. All social labor, whatever its specific concrete character, and wherever it occurs, is integrated into the organic composition of global capital. In sum, the emergence of labor in its most simple form as abstract labor not only requires the fullest development of the most modern society, it also establishes the world market as the basis, premise, and continuously reproduced result of the capitalist relation of production. In short, the tendency to create the world market is directly given in concept of capital itself. The market then does not obtain as a national market, but only with the necessity as a world market. Within this context, world trade is exclusively driven by the satisfaction of needs, that is, the needs of production. Thus, the perverse cosmopolitanism of bourgeois society. It institutionalizes itself politically in the form of the national state, while its condition of existence is the world market. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeois over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connection everywhere. Bourgeois society is a class society. Its constitutive relationship is that of the capital-labor class antagonism, whose dynamic entails the polarization of society between two different sets of property owners, one owning in the means of production, the other owning no more than their labor power. The dynamic, then, of bourgeois society is one of class struggle over, in its reformist guise, the redistribution of wealth, or in its revolutionary form, the transformation of the means of production into means of emancipation. From a capitalist perspective, the dialectic class struggle has of course to be contained to maintain the society of burghers, that is, the society of bourgeois property owners. Concerning this, the bourgeois form of the state fulfills a protective role. It protects the rights of private property, and therewith guarantees the foundation upon which bourgeois society rests. The exchange relations between property owners pertains as an exchange between the owners of commodities. The commodity, as Marx argues, is in and for itself beyond every religious, political, national, and linguistic barriers. Its language is price, and its community is the abstract wealth that money represents. Thus, capital, whether in terms of commodity capital, money capital, or productive capital, has neither a national character nor a patriotic affiliation. Its patriotism is money, and its language is profit. The cosmopolitanism of bourgeois society consists then in its concentration in the form of the state, whose time-honored role and function is to guarantee and protect the bourgeois rights of property, which themselves obtain at the international stage of an all-penetrating Freemasonry. In distinction to the debate on globalization, the state and economy are not two separate entities, a social organization. Neither can it be argued that globalization has tipped the balance between the state and the economy in favor of the economy, undermining the so-called ability of the state to organize its national economy according to social democratic principles of social justice, as allegedly was the case as Cox argues. Before capital started in the 1970s to denationalize itself, the world market is the categorical imperative of the political economy of capital, and as such the practical and conceptual conclusion of the relations of exploitation. In short, the state and the economy do not exist as externally related entities, one of which determines the other, but rather as forms of the relation which constitute them. Both are distinct in unity as forms of the capitalist relations of exploitation. The term bourgeois society is distinction to the debate on globalization does not stand for a national society. The attribute national indicates some sort of homogeneity of interest and shared values, a homogeneity that is neatly summoned by the metaphor of the one national boat. Proponents of globalization, such as Reich, argue that such an integrated national society did indeed exist prior to the globalization, and that globalization has undermined the capacity of the state to regulate its national economy according to social needs, leading to a society that is increasingly fractured on socio-economic lines. However, one might wish to assess inter alia Reich's image of a one national past. The metaphor of a one national boat stands since Roman times for a conservative conception of an organic or corporate society where everybody, regardless of position, fulfills socially valid tasks. The majority rowing, the minority navigating. The notion then of a one national economy that is being undermined by the forces of globalization makes as little sense as the idea that globalization, as Hirsch sees it, divides at once nationally integrated society along the class line. In distinction to the debate on globalization, the term bourgeois society stands from its inception not only for a class-divided society, but also, and because of this, for the global freemasonry of capital. Following Marx, just as money general exchange subsists as world money, as global exchange, so the owner of commodities, the bourgeois, is a cosmopolitan. As such, the notion of a national bourgeois, of a national capitalism, is misleading. In the Communist Manifesto, the life of the bourgeois is portrayed in terms of the global existence of capital. Old industries are destroyed and replaced by new industries, whose introduction is a question of survival within the global system of production and the division of labor, giving a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. The notion, then, of a national economy of distinct national capitalisms makes little sense. It is a regressive concept that lends itself at best to the ideas of national development methods associated with the theory and practice of economic nationalism, or at worst to the reactionary romantic ideas and practices of nationalism. Of course, protectionism was and is still a very powerful device to protect a national economy. However, neither is a national economy independent from the world market, nor does it merely exist in relation to the world market. Rather, the national economy subsists in and through the world market. Protectionism then amounts merely to a measure of defense within free trade. Whereas contemporary concepts of globalization transfer mutually dependent moments, such as, for example, territorialized political spaces and the model-like relations of distinct comparative advantage that global capital seeks to exploit, Marx's investigation shows that the first moment of capitalist state is also the first moment of generalized commodity production. Generality, however, obtains only as universality. The emergence of capital as the dominant production relation entails the emergence of a world where separate and distinct stories become subsumed and condensed into a single world mark history. Insofar as it is made, all civilized nations and every individual member of them dependent on for the satisfaction of their wants on the whole world. Marx's projected book on the world market and the conclusion of his critique of political economy indicates then that the world market is a presupposition, premise, and result of the capitalist exploitation of labor. In sum, capital has been, from its inception, a global phenomenon. This can be seen to mean that capital tries to overcome the barrier of the limited domestic market by seeking out markets on a global scale. This view, however, remains attached to an understanding of capital as a domestic force that merely seeks to overcome domestic constraints by globalizing itself. Yet Clark shows that capital was from its birth a global power. This insight is of fundamental importance because it highlights that the world market, international capitalism, the global system of social relations that has grown up for the first time in history, emerged at both the same time as the national state. Both the establishment of the national state and the world market were products of the same social struggles that revolutionized feudal society social relations. In this way, then, the question of the national integration of the state could not be divorced from that of the integration of the international state system. The emergence of the national state originated as an international system of states, a system of interstate relations that is founded on the international relations of production, international division of labor, international exchange and import, rate of exchange. Furthermore, this interstate system was from its inception embedded within the global context of production and exchange. In other words, the world market is integrated into the national economy. The world market, then, is not the sum of paraphrases, paraphrasing Hirsch, of distinct national capitalism, nor is it a recent force that has undermined the integrity of national economies. Such integrity never existed, and it makes little sense to construe it retrospectively to indicate the novel character of today's capitalist world. Rather, the world market subsists from its inception in and through the territory of states, without being identical with them. The following section examines this insight by focusing on the form and content of the world market. Alright, I'm going to interject here and try and summarize all this. So, Although Marx never completed his planned volumes on the state and world market, both dimensions remain conceptually present, as his 1857 outline frames the world market. That's section A. I did an audiobook on that, you should check out. As the world market as the final sphere, where all contradictions of bourgeois society come into play in concrete materiality. Rather than being a mere collection of distinct national economies, Marx conceptually asserts that the world market acts as the basis and the vital element of capitalist production. Instead of viewing global trade through Dave Ricardo's lenses of independent national organization via comparative advantage, Marx's framework emphasizes how global accumulation functions through an equalization of the rate of profit on a global scale. This global equalization enforces competitive standards by unleashing a regulatory heavy artillery upon any sovereign state where the domestic exploitation of labor drops below the average world market rate. Consequently, the global integration of capital transforms seemingly local conditions of labor into a single organic composition of global capital, making abstract labor a truly universal standard of wealth creation. The expansionary dynamic of capitalism constantly forces the ruling class outward, since the need of constant expanded markets for its products chases the bourgeoisie all over the whole surface of the globe. In this environment, commodities easily penetrate historical and cultural boundaries because the commodity is in and for itself beyond every religious, political, national, and linguistic barrier. Consequently, the capitalist class operates with an entirely international orientation, which means that just as general exchange, subsists as world money, as global exchange, so the owner of commodities, the bourgeois, is a cosmopolitan. Modern globalization literature, by demonstrating that distinct, self-contained national capitalisms never actually existed, as any national economy has always subsisted in and through the world market. The modern state system and international capitalism were forged concurrently out of the same historical ships, confirming that the world market, international capitalism, the global system of social relations, emerged at the same time as the national state. World market and fetishism. The world market is a historical precondition of capitalist social relations. The creation in the 16th century of a world-embracing commerce and a world-embracing market laid the historical groundwork from which capitalist social relations emerged. However, the capital relation can spring into life only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence meets in the market with the free laborer selling his labor power. The separation of labor from its means in the constitutive presupposition of capitalist social relations. The world market in the national state emerged historically in and through the primitive accumulation of capital, where labor was set free from relations of personal dependency, and conversely, where the former lord was freed from his dependent serfs. Once capital has been established as the dominant production relation, the historical precondition of its genesis transformed into presuppositions of its continued existence. The expansion of foreign trade, although the very basis of the capitalist mode of production in its infancy, has become its own product. However, with the further progress of the capitalist mode of production, through the innate necessity of this mode of production, its need for an ever-expanding market, the world market forms thus the basis for this mode of production. It is the historical foundation of capital as well as its continued result. Following Marx's outline of study, the investigation into world market and crises comes last because it would make little sense to let the conceptualization of social forms follow one another in the same sequence as that in which they were historically decisive. This sequence is determined, rather, by the relation to one another in the mode of bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of which seems to be their natural order, or which corresponds to historical development. This section argues that Marx's critique of fetishism of the value form has not just to apply to the world market, rather it is a critique of the world market. The fetishism of the value form obtains as the world of the commodity. It is this world that appears to produce the interconnection between the individual with all other individuals. Thus, the world market is understood as the most developed form of individual interconnection and interdependence. The apparent autonomization of the value form acquires then a livelihood in the apparent autonomization of the world market. From the social individual, the world market poses the totality of bourgeois social relations, and as such, a totality posits the basis of the productive practice of all individuals as alienated individuals. The world market includes not only the activity of each individual, it is also independent of this connection from the individual. The productive practice of the social individual then creates a world that, instead of being controlled by them, confronts them as an altogether independent power, as if their product has a power over them. Behind the liberation of the social individual from relations of personal dependence, the rule of objective conditions obtains individuals are now ruled by abstractions, and their abstractions subsist in the form of objective world market conditions that are independent of the individual, and although created by society, appear as if they were natural conditions, not controllable by individuals. The divorce, then, of labor from its conditions entails not only the complete independence of the individuals from one another, but also their complete dependence on the seemingly impersonal relations that the world market presents. Thus, the independence of the individual is an illusion and so more accurately called indifference. Their independence is that of atomized market individuals that are free to collide with one another and to engage in exchange within this freedom. And their indifference to each other is that of human factors of production, whose social existence as an individual appears to derive from objective conditions and their systemic laws of development. Their connection as social individuals appears to be constituted by impersonal relations, by the things themselves. The world market then appears to create a spontaneous interconnection, a material and mental metabolism, which is independent of the knowing and willing of individuals and which presupposes their reciprocal independence and indifference. The liberation of the social individual from feudal relations of personal dependency is thus overcome inasmuch as these relations of personal dependence are transformed into relations of objective dependence. Marx's insight into the alienation of the social individual to the universal form of her existence, the world market, appears to be endorsed by the debate on globalization. In this debate, the world market is understood in terms of an irresistible objective coercive force. However, in distinction of this view, Marx does not conceive of the world market in terms of an objective thing in itself. Rather, the world market is posed as a universal existence of the fetishism of the commodity form, thus the coercive character of the world market has a real existence. However, its objective coercive force does not derive from the world market as such. The world market appears as if it were a thing in itself only when it is conceived in abstraction from the relation of class that constitutes the global world of capital. The conception of the world market as a thing in itself abstracts from the conditions of existence within which these individuals enter into contact. The notion then of the world market as an objective coercive force makes sense only on the assumption that the reified world of capital entails the immediate and direct proof of the general laws of capital social relations. Against contemporary conceptions of the global power of capital, the point of the critique of political economy is not to accept the reified existence of capital, but to study its social constitution. In distinction then to the debate on globalization, it is an insipid notion to conceive of this merely objective bond as a spontaneous, natural attribute inherent in individual and inseparable from their nature. This bond is their product. It is a historic product. Thus, to conceive of the world market merely in terms of objective relations of dependency is to endorse the ideological projections of capital. The debate on globalization is premised on an understanding of capital in terms of competing capitalist interest, and the strategic choice and decisions of especially transnational banks and multinational companies. The debate suggests that it is capitalist competition that constitutes and determines capitalist development. In short, the debate on globalization seeks to rationalize the strategic calculation of particularly transnational banks and multinational companies, and to trace the likely socio-political consequences of their action. Globalization theory, in other words, conforms its theoretical view to the self-image of capital as an economic force that exists by and in itself. However, and against such mysterious conceptions of capital, capital cannot confront capital if capital does not confront labor, since capital is only capital as non-labor. The understanding then of the global relation of capital has to go forward through an examination of the relations of exploitation, and that is through an understanding of the dependence of capital on labor. Capital cannot liberate itself from labor, it has to confront labor, and it can confront labor only if it imposes necessary labor on the worker. Capital does not compete with capital for nothing, it competes for a greater share in the abstract wealth pumped out of labor. It is only foreign trade, the development of the world market to a world market, which causes money to develop into world money, and the abstract labor into social labor. Abstract wealth, value, money, hence abstract labor, develop in the measure that concrete labor becomes the totality of different modes of labor, embracing the world market. Capitalist production rests on the value or the transformation of the labor embodied in the product into social labor, but this is only possible on the basis of foreign trade and of the world market. This is at once the precondition and result of capitalist production. In other words, the understanding of capital as an objective coercive force obscures rather than reveals the constitution of capital. It does not include human natural force. Force is the productive power of labor. Labor is value creating, and the social character of exploited labor does not show itself except in the act of exchange. Capital, as Marx insists, only appears afterwards, after already having been presupposed as capital, a vicious circle, as command over alien labor. Capital appears only afterwards because it is through exchange that the exploitation of labor is validated in terms of social necessary labor time of value. In other words, capital is neither a thing, nor can it be identified with the individual companies, however multinational they might be. Capital is a definite social production relation. And because of this, the concept of capital makes sense only when labor is seen as presence within capital. The understanding of capital as command over labor, as a perennial pumping machine of surplus labor, provides a quite different understanding of the world market of global capital to those approaches that see it merely as an objective coercive force. The world market becomes instead a space constituted by the presence of labor within the concept of capital. A global relation of command, and is such a relation that subsists in and through the contradictory constitution of this command, a crisis-ridden relationship of exploitation, and therewith class struggle. Marx's critique of political economy is not satisfied with an analysis of the operation of exchange relations. Rather, his project is to understand the social constitution of these relations, and that is the social constitution of value. The act of exchange does not explain the generation of the thing that is being exchanged, nor does it explain why the individual producer exists in the way they do. Political economy is an attempt to understand exchange relations, and from within exchange relations, the relations of production. Thus, at best, Ricardo's theory of value, following Negri, merely shows that the development of social labor produces either a process of accumulation of value or a complex norm of distribution. The secret of the social constitution of value remained unresolved because value was merely conceived as a thing and not as a social relationship. Yet this debasement of human relations as relations between things is as real as the fact that, on the other hand, there would be nothing without individuals and their spontaneities. In other words, the movement of value manifests itself as an automatic movement, acting with the force of an elemental natural process as if it were an independent thing. That is, historically, active and stands above social structures, social relations, and dictating to the social individual as if it were an unresistible force in its own right. However, value is this independent thing only if looked at merely in terms of its formal mode of movement, that is, in terms of the fetishism of capital as value-creating things. This fetishism is due to the circumstance that all of labor's social productive force appears to be due to capital rather than labor as such. There is no doubt that human practice subsists in and through the world of commodities, as if a person objectifies himself in production and the thing subjectifies itself in the person. There is, however, no form without content. To argue that form exists without content is to say that form is external to its own constitution. Like the notion of the world market as an objective coercive thing, the notion of value as a form without content espouses the religion of bourgeois society. Commodity fetishism it espouses, in other words, the notion of capital as a thing in itself. In sum, approaches that focus on the global world of capital as an objective coercive force merely describes what is already presupposed. Social existence obtains within a framework of objective economic laws whose rationally imposes itself objectively on the protagonist and set in motion the decisive conditions of economic adjustment to global capital requirements. In other words, human social practice is seen as something that is condemned to execute economic laws. In contrast to such views, Marx's critique of fetishism shows that the derivation of human social practice from action of object reformulates the doctrine of the invisible hand. In this way, social reality is seen to be governed by something which cannot be comprehended, let alone determined. Human productive relations are governed by something invisible, and this invisible defines the conditions and circumstances of human existence. However, the invisible operates with an iron fist. Those unaware of its operation will feel its cold and dispassionate hand. All that can be done is to accommodate and comply with the rule of the invisible and irresistible hand. Social practice is thus derived from something which transcends human understanding and transformative power. In other words, social existence is a fate rather than a social act. Approaches that rest on the assumption of the world market as a constituted thing of global capital as an objective coercive force are not actually only endorsing capital as some sort of economic law of nature, they are also, and because of this, doctrinaire in their conception of capital. According to Horkheimer, one of the blind spots of dogmatic thought is the separation of genesis from existence. Indeed, if capital is endorsed as a constituted thing, its dynamic appears to derive from a blind and impersonal system logic to which the social individual has to accommodate and conform in order to stay alive. Dogmatism, of course, feels most at home in approaches that refuse to understand the social world we live in as a world constituted in and through human social practice. However perverted this practice might be. In short, the constitution of the world occurs behind the backs of the individuals, yet it is their work. Following Marx, it is only in the market of the world that money acquires to the full extent the character of the commodity, whose bodily form is also the immediate social incarnation of human labor in the abstract. Furthermore, it is a tendency of capital to pull away the national ground from the foundation of every industry and to transform it to conditions of production outside itself into a general context. This undermining of locality entails the general foundation of all industry comes to generate role exchange itself. The world market, and hence the totality of all activities of which it is made up. In this way, the search for new markets, new natural resources, and new workers is a constant search. Kaffins's treatment of the contemporary debt crisis as a renewed phase of primitive accumulation and new enclosure movement has made it to commend it. The enforcement of debt through the transformation of subsistence, economies, and relations of communal production into relations of capitalist exchange characterizes not only the period of the Industrial Revolution, it characterizes the contemporary politics of global capital. In short, primitive accumulation is a constantly reproduced accumulation, be it in terms of the contemporary separation of new populations from the means of production and subsistence, or in terms of the reproduction of the wage relation in the established relation of capital. The former seeks to bring new workers under the command of capital, and the latter to retain them. The positing of the means of production as capital is based on the existence of labor as objectless free labor under the command of capital. The primitive accumulation of capital is not just a presupposition of capital that merely pertains as its historical past, rather it is constitutive of capitalist social relations and as such has to be posited and reproduced within the established existence of capital. Capitalist accumulation merely presents as a continuous process what in primitive accumulation appears as distinct historical process as the emergence of capital. The world market then is founded on the worker's propertylessness. The divorce of labor from her condition is the presupposition of capital, a presupposition that capital has to reproduce in order to retain and maintain labor as objectless free labor and therewith as an exploitable resource. It is clear that capital presupposes labor as wage labor. The innate necessity of capital is then not just to create a constantly widening sphere of circulation, whether the sphere itself is directly expanded or whether more points within it are created as points of production. The universality of capital towards its irresistibility strives. Amounts also to the universalization of its genesis as a condition and presupposition of its established world market's existence. The world market is thus the basis of capitalist relations of exchange, and through exchange of the relations of exploitation. In sum, capital creates not only bourgeois society and the universal appropriation of nature, as well as of the social bond itself by other members of society by means of generalized exchange. It also carries with it its dependence on labor. It has to exploit labor in order to preserve itself as capital, and it can preserve itself as capital only in and through the progressive exploitation of labor's productive power. The world market then scans not just for the global expansion of capital, but importantly for the universality of the class antagonism between capital and labor, and therewith the totality of its own contradictory constitution. Capital is capital only in and through the constitution of human social practice as a perverted practice, as an objectless practice, which obtains in the form of a wage-laboring commodity. However, capital has no logic independent of labor's, however perverted, social existence, as indicated by Schmidt. The reality in which the social individual moves day in and day out has no invariant character. That is something which exists independently from it. Thus, the critique of political economy amounts to a conceptualized praxis. That is, an understanding of the totality of human social practice, which constitutes, suffuses, and contradicts the world of capital. Thus, in order to understand the working of the world market, one has to descend from its objective coercive existence to an analysis of the social relations of production, from the sphere of circulation to the constitution of value, from the objectless existence of labor to the relationship between necessary and surplus labor, and from the exploitation of labor to capital's dependency on labor's value creating power. In sum, one has conceptualized the displacement of production towards the world market, and conversely, the constitution of the world market as the space where the perverted productive practice of the social individual acquires its livelihood as capitalist command over living labor. The existence of the social individual as an exploitable resource is as real as the circumstance that capital is nothing without human social practice. In sum, for the third time, capital is a living contradiction. Labor is and remains the presupposition of the law of capital to create surplus labor. This then is the law of capital. To avoid the threat of its own capital punishment, it is condemned to exploit labor. For capital, then to assert itself as non-labor, it has to posit necessary labor. In other words, for the fourth time, capital forces the worker beyond necessary labor to surplus labor. Only in this way does it realize itself and create surplus value, but on the other there it posits necessary labor only to the extent insofar as it is surplus labor, and the latter realizable as surplus labor. It posits surplus labor, then, as a condition of the necessary, and surplus labor as the limit of objectified labor of value as such. As soon as it cannot posit value, it does not posit necessary labor, and given its foundation, it cannot be otherwise. The world market then obtains in and through the capitalist tendency to make human labor superfluous, so as to drive it as human labor towards infinity. Capital then exists in antithesis to necessary labor, and at the same time, only in and through the imposition of necessary labor. It cannot posit surplus labor without positing necessary labor. Labor is the creatix of surplus value. At the same time, as it obtains a wage-laboring commodity at the disposal of capital as the owner of the means of production, it appears then that capital posits the production of wealth itself, and hence the universal development of the productive forces, the constant overthrow of its prevailing presupposition as a presupposition of its reproduction. Thus, the social individual appears as an individual subjected to constant coercive pressure emanating from the world of capital, the world market. At the same time, however, these pressures are brought out of him by his labor. Free labor, commodified labor, is capital's presupposition. A presupposition that shows itself as alien wealth based on the poverty of the worker. The form of the world market appears then as an autonomized thing. However, its presupposition is the class struggle over capital's imposition of necessary labor on the worker. Capital depends upon the imposition of necessary labor to constitute the side of surplus labor, and thus surplus value. This dependence constitutes capital's contradictory existence, inasmuch as necessary labor is not only the constituted side of surplus value, but also, and because of this, the bearer the capitalist command over labor. The constant revolutionizing of the relation between necessary labor and surplus labor does not create capital's wealth as such. Rather, as the next section explains, it develops the human productive force that suffuses and constitutes the crisis-ridden development of capital's accumulation. In conclusion, the entire development of human productive forces, i.e. wealth, proceeds in a contradictory way. The world market is not just posed as the most spacious expansion of capital's existence, but also, and importantly, as the world's history of its dependence on labor. As Marx put it, the world market is the conclusion in which production is posited as a totality together with all its moments, but within which at the same time, all contradictions come into play. The world market then forms the presupposition of the whole as well as its substratum. As such, a substratum, the world market makes the constitution of value through labor not only invisible, but in fact shows the direct opposite of its constitution. It is as if Monsieur le Capitaux and Madame la Terre do their ghost walking as social characteristics at the same time, directly as more things. So that's the end of Volume 3. In sum, understanding the world market as a global space, founded on the separation of labor from the means of production and emancipation, entails that the world market constitutes the totality of activities, these intercourse, needs, etc., of which it is made up. The category of the world market is thus not a category among others, rather it is the substratum through which all other categories of Marx's critique of political economy subsist. The world market is the presupposition of all and the support of the whole. The presupposition of the world market is human labor, whose productive power exists against itself, as if its world is that of relations between things, which appear to be endowed with laws that derive from these things themselves, and whose irresistible developmental logic imposes itself, as globalization orthodoxy argues, upon the living individual as an economic dictate. Globalization orthodoxy seems to agree with Marx's insight that individuals are ruled by abstractions. However, in distinction to globalization theory, these are not abstractions endowed with systemic force as if they existed external to and divorced from the social individual. Rather, they are constituted in and through the productive and disruptive power of social practice. The global world of capital then subsists as the space where the abstraction of the category of labor as such, labor pure and simple, becomes true in practice. The social relation, which constitutes this determination of labor in capitalist society, is a relation between necessary labor and surplus labor. That is, the class antagonism between capital and labor, which constitutes the social working day on a global scale. Alright, and to summarize that up, I have some notes here. The 16th century creation of global commerce laid the historical groundwork from which capitalist relations emerged. Though capital can only spring to life when owners of production meet free laborers sowing their labor power in the market. Once capital becomes established, its early foundation in foreign trade transforms into an innate necessity driven by a systemic need for an ever-expanding market. Under this regime, commodity fetishism manifests at a global scale, culminating in the apparent autonomization of the world market from the very individuals who produce it. Rather than commanding their own output, the productive practice of social individuals creates a perverted reality where they are ruled by abstractions that appear as uncontrollable natural conditions. This shift forces atomized market individuals into an illusion of independence that is more accurately called indifference, meaning they are simply free to collide as human factors of production within impersonal relations. Globalization theory often reproduces this fetishism by viewing the market as an irresistible objective coercive force, or a thing in itself, thereby adopting the ideological projections and self-image of capital. Rejecting this dogmatic systemic view, capital cannot exist as an independent force because capital cannot confront capital if capital does not confront labor. Consequently, the global market serves as the ultimate site where money develops into world money and abstract labor into social labor, relying on foreign trade as both its precondition and its result. Beneath the surface labor of global exchange relations lies a perennial pumping machine of surplus labor, which frames the world market not as a neutral economic structure, but as a global relation of command. Ultimately, the world market represents a highly volatile space in which production is posited as a totality, together with all its moments, but within which at the same time, all contradictions come into play. World market and crises. Inherent in every concept of capital is the innate necessity of creating an ever-expanding market. The expansion of the market into the last corner of the world is, according to Marx, one of the counter-tendencies to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There is then the tendency of capital to create ever more and more points of exchange and to develop the world market further through the exploration of all nature in order to discover new useful qualities in things, new universal exchange of the products of all alien climates and land. new artificial preparations of natural objects by which they are given a new use value. The exploration of the earth in all directions. Furthermore, the extension of the market goes hand in hand with attempts to annihilate space through time. In distinction to contemporary ideas that globalization is driven by some sort of a law inherent in modern technology, the formation of new technology that replaces space by time is a process that is socially constituted itself. Circulation time is the barrier to the reproduction of labor, an increase in necessary labor time, a decrease in surplus labor time. Thus, the development of more and more modern means of communication in order to be present in all markets all the time. Equally, the expansion of credit relations allows the creation of ever more surplus labor by reducing the time productive capital is suspended in circulation, or by bridging the gap between the investment requirements of productive capital and the profits acquired in exchange. Capitalist crisis is not simply a crisis of overproduction or underconsumption, nor is it merely a crisis of capitalist overaccumulation, where too much capital confronts saturated world markets. Overaccumulation of capital is the form in which crises assert itself. Each individual capitalist has constantly to expand his capital in order to preserve it, but extend it he cannot, except by means of progressive accumulation. The risk is bankruptcy. Thus, mediation through competition capital is spurred into action. Fanatically bent on making value expand itself, the personified capitalist ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake, increasing the mass of human beings exploited by him, depositing of the results of human labor as a force over and above the social individual, including both the capitalist and the wage laborer, and the fanatic bent on making workers work for the sake of work, is founded on the separation of labor from its means. The freedom of the social individual from its conditions entails the capitalist property rights to preserve abstract wealth through the sacrifice of human machines on the pyramid of accumulation. Capitalist property rights entails that labor capacity has appropriated for itself only the subjective conditions of necessary labor, the means of subsistence for activity producing labor capacity, such as the reproduction as mere labor capacity separated from the conditions of its realization, and it has posited these conditions themselves as things, values which confront it in an alien, commanding personification. In short, capital is a social relationship between labor and the conditions of labor which are rendered independent in relation to labor, and which, however independent, exist as capital only if capital confronts labor by imposing necessary labor on the world's working class. The circumstance that the equalization of the rate of profit obtains at the level of the world market means that the individual capitalist always has the world market before him, compares and must constantly compare his own cost price with the market price at home and throughout the world. For capital, then, to preserve its existing value, it has constantly to increase the productive power of labor, and that is, to compress necessary labor. What restricts capitalist production, then, is not commerce, insofar as it expresses the existing demand, but the magnitude of employed capital and the level of development of the productivity of labor. The investment required to set labor in motion in production increases the cost price of production, which even under conditions of a rising rate of exploitation, tends to decrease the rate of profit. This is so because of the rising value of constant capital, means of production, relative to variable capital, labor power. The revolutionizing of the means and methods of production involves the constant class struggle over the integration of labor into the production process as an exploitable resource, suppressing the disruptive power of labor in favor of it in compliant application as a human factor of production. The containment of labor's disruptive power and the harnessing of its productive power are two sides of the same coin of the imposition of necessary labor upon social labor power. It is the constant struggle over the integration of labor as a productive factor into the capital relation that constitutes the foundation of the crisis of capitalist accumulation. Capital is limited by its very nature, inasmuch as the development of human productive forces liberates social labor relative from production through the revolutionizing of its productive power. Thus, capital contradicts itself because it restricts labor in the creation of value, and does so on the same grounds as and to the same extent that it posits surplus labor and surplus value. By its nature, therefore, it posits a barrier to labor and value creation in contradistinction to its tendency to expand them boundlessly. Each individual is compelled, if its devaluation is to be avoided, to appropriate surplus value on an expanding scale. This imposes upon each capital the necessity of expelling living labor from the process of production by decreasing necessary labor to its utmost. This process relates to the relation between necessary labor and surplus labor, that is, the relation between the constitutive part of the working day and the class relation which constitutes it. While capital can do no other than to revolutionize the reproductive power of labor in order to preserve itself as capital, the increase in labor's productive power renders capitalist accumulation crisis-ridden. In other words, the containment of the disruptive power of labor through its integration into the capital relation as a human factor of production is contradictory. It reasserts the disruptive power of labor through the increase of its productive force, although the workers regard the development of the productive power of its own labor as hostile to himself. It is a development of his productive power that sets limits to the preservation of capital through expanded accumulation. The barrier then to capital is capital itself. The existence of the means of production as capital entails that the incessant quest to preserve their existence as capital through the progressive exploitation of labor is crisis-ridden. For capital to maintain its existence, it has yet to condemn labor power to the scrap heap of abstract wealth, yet it depends on this power for the production of value. Capital realizes itself only when it forces the workers beyond necessary labor to surplus labor. What needs to be made manifest then is that the exploitation of labor's productive power renders capital's accumulation crisis-ridden because labor produces too much value than can be realized with the rate of profit adequate to the continuous accumulation of capital on a progressive scale. To recap, the revolutionizing of labor's productive power entails a relative decrease to the ratio of variable to constant capital. This decrease indicates the development of the social productivity of labor. Less living labor is needed to produce the same amount of commodities. While labor's productive power increases, the cost price of production grows in terms of constant capital relative to variable capital. The value constituents representing necessary labor. The class struggle over capital's tendency to decrease necessary labor so as to increase surplus labor value increases the amount of investment in constant capital relative to variable capital, and this in order to make its command over labor count in terms of profit. There is then a contradiction between the capitalist tendency to develop the forces of production without limits and the need to confine accumulation within the limits of the social relationship of production. Both a fall in the rate of profit and a decline in the rate of accumulation express the productive power of labor. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall, including the counter tendencies to its fall, is identical in meaning. With the development of the productive power of labor, crisis then signals the overaccumulation of capital, not just in relation to the realization of surplus value, but importantly to the preservation of capital through the progressive accumulation of capital, and that is through the progressive exploitation of labor. Capital's crisis then asserts the presence of labor within the concept of capital. The other side of exploitation of labor's productive power is the crisis of capital's accumulation. A fall in the rate of profit can, of course, be compensated by the devaluation of capital, the bankruptcy of producers, liquidation of so-called excess productive capacity, mass unemployment, and the concentration and centralization of capital in fewer and fewer hands. A fall in the rate of profit can also be offset by an increase in the mass of profits. Such an increase requires the realization of growing mass of commodities, rendering in economics of scale a counter-tendency to the declining rates of profit. This insight is very much emphasized by the debate on globalization in terms of the power of multinational companies, of the concentration of productive capital in fewer companies, their worldwide chase for new markets for the mass-produced commodities and their search for cheaper labor. In contrast to this debate, this concentration and centralization of economic might does not herald a new sort of capitalism, as if globalized capital were an unassailable and invincible thing in itself. As was discussed earlier, the means of production become capital only insofar as they have become separated from the laborer and confronts labor as an independent power. In the course of capitalist reproduction, the separation of labor from its conditions is a continuously imposed separation. In short, the separation begins with primitive accumulation, appears as a permanent process in the accumulation and concentration of capital, and expresses itself finally as centralization of existing capitals in a few hands and deprivation of many of their capital, to which expropriation has now changed. The circumstance that big fish eat small fish does not render obsolete the understanding of capital as a definite social relation entered into by individuals in the process of reproducing their life. It merely shows that the terror of separation of capitalism's original beginnings weighs like a nightmare on human social practice. Capitalist crises assert themselves in the form of unemployed money capital, that is, capital fails to make a reasonable profit from exploiting labor and is spilled over into speculative channels seeking profitable returns through interest-bearing investment or currency speculation, or indeed by facilitating takeovers and mergers. The so-called plethora of capital always applies essentially to a plethora of capital for which the fall in the rate of profit is not compensated through the massive profit. This is always true of newly developing fresh offshoots of capital, or to a plethora which places capitals incapable of action on their own at the disposal of the managers of large enterprises in the form of credit. It is this plethora of capital that for Strange and others characterizes the new phase capitalism of globalization. However, the so-called credit superstructure of globalization represents a capital that cannot be converted into direct productive activity. In other words, money capital is unemployed because it cannot be converted into expanded command over labor. Hence, unemployed capital at one pole and unemployed workers at the other. The sustaining of overaccumulation through credit expansion implies a potentially disastrous speculative deferral of economic crises on a global scale. This is because money capital accumulates in the form of a potentially worthless claim on future surplus value. The solidity and very existence of money capital is endangered insofar as a progressive deterioration of the relation between credit and exploitation renders capital in its elementary form of money potentially meaningless. In sum, the divorce of monetary accumulation from productive accumulation obtains as a mortgage on the future a speculative gamble over future exploitation of labor. This speculative betting then indicates a loosening of the relationship between capital and the exploitation of labor in the present. In other words, the less credit expansion is supported by the generation of surplus value through the exploitation of labor in the present, the more the credit structure is at risk of losing its grip on the very source that supports its commanding existence as abstract capitalist wealth. There is then no doubt that capital can divorce itself from labor as emphasized by the debate on globalization. However, this divorce cannot herald a new sort of capitalism that accumulates wealth without exploiting labor. Instead, it emphasizes the dependence on capital upon labor. Capital's divorce from labor is more ideal than real. The contradictory unity of surplus production reasserts itself in M to M prime, money to money prime, the meaningless form of capital, the perversion and objectification of production relations in their highest degree. The interest-bearing form, the simple form of capital in which it antecedents its own process of reproduction. It appears then as if the social relation is consummated in the relation of a thing, of money to itself. However, interest is only a portion of the profit of the surplus value, which the functioning capital squeezes out of the laborer. In sum, while capital in the form of money assumes the form of an automatic fetish, it appropriates unpaid labor, and it is such a power because it commands the labor of others, bestowing a claim to appropriate the labor of others, and therefore represents self-expanding value. Although we see an interest-bearing capital only form without content, money must command labor so as to sustain itself as a universal form of abstract labor. It cannot forge the slow pace, the daily struggle for the extortion of surplus value, and yet it is this forgetfulness which characterizes the divorce of monetary accumulation from productive accumulation, as if capital has assumed an independent existence from labor. Although in M to M prime, the relation to labor as the substance of value is seemingly eliminated, the expansion of monetary accumulation exists as a claim of ownership upon labor, that is, a claim on a portion of future surplus value. In conclusion, the divorce of monetary accumulation from productive accumulation indicates the crisis of capitalism's innate necessity of imposing necessary labor on the working class on a global scale. The circumstance that capitalist production is sustained by credit expansion and debt, including its recycling, indicates the speculative dimension of capitalist command over labor, and that is the fictitious integration of labor into the capital relation itself. A monetary panic and industrial crash are two sides of the same coin. In a certain way, then, globalization orthodoxy rightly points out that capital has left labor behind. In distinction to the proponents of globalization, this does not, however, not indicate that capital has solved its crisis of accumulation. Instead, this leaving behind of labor is at the heart of the contemporary crisis of capital's accumulation. Capital might well go beyond its limitations, its dependency on necessary labor. However, the fact that capital posits every such limit as a barrier and hence gets ideally beyond it, it does not by any means follow that it has really overcome it. Credit expansion does not really overcome capital's contradictory constitution, but merely sustains the reality of its crisis. Credit expansion requires validation through the progressive exploitation of labor. However, credit expansion developed in inflationary form, or divorced from direct command over labor, because of the over-exploitation of labor, or to use a friendlier expression, the overaccumulation of capital. The contemporary crisis on global finance and the intense pressure brought to bear on the working class confirms the crisis of capital's overaccumulation as a crisis of imposing necessary labor, and therewith surplus labor on the whole class on the global scale. The safeguarding of credit depends on how effectively capital can exploit labor and of how effectively labor resists exploitation. Capital has to command labor. Productive accumulation has to succeed in order for money capital in the form of credit to be sustained. Failure to turn credit into effective command over labor turns debt into bad debt, leading to the deflation of credit and the threatening insolvency and bankruptcy of for money capital and productive capital alike. In conclusion, the search for new markets, the concentration and centralization of capital on a global scale, and the divorce of money from direct command over labor, as well as the mass unemployment, does not support the view that globalization heralds a new regime of accumulation. The proponents of globalization correctly suggest that the capital integrates more and more living labor into the organic composition of capital. However, this expansion of capital relation amounts to an ever broader process of the constitution of the average rate of profit, and it is here that the contradiction inherent in profit, the antagonism of its constituted force, imposes itself. The world history of capital is not characterized by the globalization of capital as if capital amounts to no more than an economic mechanism that, in neoliberal terms, self-regulates itself through the hands of the invisible, nor is it an economic mechanism that in Keynesian terms fulfills useful economic functions if it is regulated well by the good offices of the state. Capital is a definite social production relation between capital and labor. If anything, then globalization does not just mean the globalization of capital, but rather the globalization of the dependency of capital upon labor. In short, the creation of a world market society would almost to the extension of the collective potency of the production and disruptive power of labor. It is this power capital has to contain as the source of the progressive accumulation of abstract wealth. The world market society is the terrain where the contradictory constitution of capital, its dependence on and antithesis to necessary labor, asserts itself as a crisis of credit, as a speculative pressure on national currencies, and in terms of financial turmoil and industrial crisis. The other side of labor's productive power is the potentially irredeemable accumulation of unemployed capital, of debt. Marx characterized the situation as the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself. Within capitalist society, this contradiction can be contained only through force, including not only the destruction of productive capacities, unemployment, worsening conditions, and widespread poverty, but also the destruction of human life through war and starvation. Force is as meaningless and elementary as the accumulation of abstract wealth for accumulation's sake. Alright, so some notes here. Driven by an innate necessity to generate an ever-expanding market, capital expands globally to counteract the tendency of the rate of profit to fall through exhaustive exploration of the earth in all directions. This geographic expansion is accompanied by efforts to annihilate space through time, a socially constituted process designed to reduce circulation time because it acts as a barrier to the reproduction of labor. Under competitive pressure, the personified capitalist becomes fanatically bent on making value expand itself and ruthlessly pushes humanity to produce for the sake of production to avoid bankruptcy. To preserve value, capitalists must constantly compare domestic cost price with international market price, forcing them to relentlessly increase productivity and compress necessary labor. Paradoxically, this drive creates a barrier to capital because the resulting revolution in production methods expels living labor, meaning capital restricts labor and the creation of value on the same grounds that it boundlessly seeks to expand them. The continuous displacement of workers in favor of machinery triggers an overaccumulation crisis, demonstrating that the barrier then to capital is capital itself. When capital fails to secure adequate profits from direct exploitation, it spills into speculative channels, resulting in a crisis marked by unemployed capital at one pole and unemployed workers at the other. While credit expansion temporarily sustains overaccumulation, it creates a dangerous mismatch where monetary accumulation functions merely as a speculative claim of ownership upon labor and a mortgage on future surplus value. Although globalization orthodoxy suggests that financial markets have detached from production, from the fact that capital posits every such limit as a barrier, and hence gets ideally beyond it, it does not by any means follow that it has really overcome it. And ultimately, globalization does not signify the victory of an independent economic mechanism, but rather the globalization of the dependency of capital upon labor, a fundamental contradiction that capital repeatedly attempts to contain through economic force and social destruction. So, just to make that even more clear, okay, globalization isn't like a process that will abolish the nation state and then there will be a global revolution. No, globalization is just merely a symptom of the current form of the policies of capital and how it needs to operate. Capital is already global. It's already global. There's no requisite to engage in globalization in order to defeat nationalism to then have, some sort of global government that you can then have one revolution for or something. That's just silly. Okay, you're always, even like, I'm arguing kind of against a straw man, but there are definitely, well, not really, this is actually kind of a common view, honestly. There's like a party in the UK, for example, that sort of works on this. They call like their opponents chauvinists or something, but their whole idea is like, we need to do the EU and have this integrated market, and then there can be a unified revolution or something because of this, and that's just so silly to believe. Like, because first of all, the UK, just say you do that, like, the national governments, they're not going to be disavowed, they're not going to disband or anything. That's never happening. Okay, like, it's silly. You won't abolish national governments through quote-unquote globalism. That's not how that works. You'll just have two governments. And this doesn't also mean the other side of, therefore, oppose globalism. Well, I mean, kinda. Actually, it does mean that, actually. Honestly. It's just, also don't support nationalism, basically. I'm saying not to support either. Okay, is what I'm trying to convey here. Okay, in the conclusion, world market, labor, and the national state. The debate on globalization fails to address the very contradiction that lies at the heart of capital's existence. It ignores the circumstance that labor is a presence within the concept of capital, however globalized capital might be. Capital can neither run away nor liberate itself from labor. Instead of conceptualizing the contradictory constitution of capital, the debate on globalization offers abstract generalizations which already presuppose what ostensibly is set out to explain. Capital reigns supreme. Against this view, this chapter has argued that capital is a living contradiction. There is no doubt that capital seeks to fragment and disperse the working class. However, that this is so already posed by the existence of, that this is so is already proposed by the existence of the wage relation. Capital is not dependent upon its workers, they can be made redundant. However, capital's independence from particular workers does not imply that it is independent from labor. Capital has to deposit value, and in order to do that, it has to deposit necessary labor. Capital depends on labor, and it has to pump surplus labor out of the worker in order to secure its existence as capital. The question of space is not a question of the globalization of capital. Posing the issue in this way already presumes that labor is in fact not a presence within the conceptual concept of capital. It is, however, this presence that renders capital's accumulation crisis-ridden. The national and global are not externally related things. This chapter has argued that the class antagonism between capital and labor subsists through the world market, and that the containment of labor within the realm of the property rights and of capital subsists through national states. Of course, the national and the global are not identical, but neither are they related to each other as merely external entities that happen to collide with one another from time to time. The globe and the national are not different in unity, they are moments of the social relations of production which constitute their distinct forms of existence, suffuse their interrelation, and contradict their differentiation. The global dimension of the capital relation is a-spatial character, is thus not without space. The a-spatial existence, in fact, contradictory through nationally divided spaces of political sovereignty. In sum, the concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state entails its function to secure and guarantee the rights of private property. The national state, then, is the harmony's last refuge. The harmonies of equality, freedom, liberty, and Bentham. The wage relation subsists through these harmonies. Further, the entanglement of all people in the net of the world market, and with this, the international character of the capitalist regime entails the function of the national state to secure the property rights of capital as cosmopolitan rights. Further, the existence of the social individual as owner of commodities means that the private interest without each nation divides itself into as many nations as it is fully grown individuals. These many nations within the national territory are concentrated in the form of the state in terms of the rule of law and its enforcement. The protection of the rights of private property guarantees equal exchange relations between the sellers and buyers of labor power, and through this guarantees the bourgeois relations of exploitation. The relation of national state to capital appears as a relation of a nationally fixed state to a globally mobile capital. However, and as Clark puts it, although the state is constituted politically on a national basis, its class character is not defined in national terms. The capitalist law of property and contract transcending national legal systems and world money transcending national currencies. Nation-states are not only in competition with each other, as each tries to divert the flow of money capital into its particular territory, they exist also as a particular node within the global flow of capital. The nation-state exists through the global relation of exploitation and is confined within limits imposed by the contradictory form of the accumulation of capital on a world scale. In other words, the concept of national wealth makes no sense. Wealth is not created to enrich the state or the nation, nor is it the purpose of the state to produce wealth. Nevertheless, the notion of the national economy or of the national interest is of course a powerful weapon with which to induce the domestic working class to exert greater and greater effort to sustain their employment. There is, as the contemporary notion of the competition state sees it, no doubt that if a capital is not allowed to get the greatest net revenue that the use of machinery will afford here, it will be carried abroad, leading to serious discouragement to the demand of labor. The debate on globalization divides the history of capitalist development into two distinct phases. The phase before the onset of globalization is examined through the theoretical lens of economic nationalism, and the phase of globalization through those of economic liberalism. For the globalizationists, globalization is a neoliberal strategy that is directed against national regulated systems in favor of market self-regulation on the global scale. For Hirsch, globalization shows not only capital's inherent ability to overcome crises of production, but also the ability of capital to transcend national borders in search of the most favorable conditions for direct economic gains and the highest possible margin of profit. For Hirsch, the consequence of the globalization of capital is that the national state is no longer able to regulate its economy in a comprehensive and coherent way. Its ability to do that has been hollowed out. As a consequence, globalization has rendered impossible a politics in favor of improving the conditions of all citizens. The globalization of capital is thus seen to erode the capacity of an individual state to control its own economic future, and that boundaries between states have become blurred, and that the autonomy of the state has been limited. It seems that the globalization is perceived as a force that undermines national Keynesian and therewith a politics of full employment and a comprehensive welfare provisions. Was a Keynesian policy of full employment and welfare really the central priority of the national state before capital globalized itself? Might there not be a good case for arguing that the proponents of globalization create an image of the past that never was true in practice in order to draw a sharp contrast to what they perceive as a new form of capitalist development, that is globalization. The debate on globalization is founded on an analytical perspective that sets out to generalize empirical data in an abstract theoretical terms. Might this not imply that the debate confuses the ideological projection of capital with reality? Of course, some proponents of globalization recognize the social injustice that globalization causes. Hence, they call for a democratic renewal at the national and international level. Yet this recognition does not have any significance for the analysis of globalization. Globalization is treated as if it is an objectively unfolding development, and it is examined according to impartial scientific principles, as if impartiality towards the reified world of capital holds the key to understanding its social constitution. Impartiality does not amount to objectivity, it amounts instead to a vague judgment that espouses the disenchanted and perverted world of capital as if it were a law unto itself. In short, the life world of the social or individual is derived from the apparent partial development of logic of capital. Against this view, this chapter is argued that the world of capital finds its rational explanation in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. The proponents of globalization argue that globalization stands for the end of a capitalist history defined by cohesive national economies or national capitalism. The notion of the national economy is based on misleading premises. First, it is premised on the idea that capitalist exploitation of labor within a nationally organized space is, as implied by the use of the metaphor of the one national boat, based on some sort of national harmony of interest. The national interest. The claim that the national relations of exploitation consisted in national harmony should be dismissed as at best nonsense or at worst deceitful publicity. It is of course true that conservative idealist solutions to the labor question focus not just on the state as an institution, that policies the law-abiding conduct between equals on the labor market. The state is also endorsed as an institution that is capable of discharging ethical and moral functions with a view to generating social consensus so that the dependent masses accept their natural position in society. Why the proponents of globalization portray the state of the pre-globalization era through Burkean lens cannot be discussed here. Second, the notion of the national economy is premised on the idea that the limits of national harmony to national wealth are not constituted in and through capitalist dependence on labor. Rather, national wealth is seen to be limited by external forces which disrupt the integrity of national economies. Thus, disharmony is merely imported from the outside. In his critique of Carey's economic nationalist ideas, Marx argues forcefully that these world market disharmonies are merely the ultimate adequate expressions of disharmonies which have become fixed as abstract relations within the economic categories, or which have a local existence on the smallest scale. In other words, global disharmony exists in and through domestic relations and vice versa. Capitalist relations of exploitation do not exist in terms of two sets of relations, that is, as relations of domestic harmony, and distinct from these as relations of global disharmony. As the quote from Marx makes clear, the world market form is the mode of existence of domestic relations, and conversely, domestic relations subsist in and through the form of the world market. The international relations between states are not merely those of economic interdependence, but subsist in and through the social relation that constitutes state as moments of the global composition of class relations. National states then compete with each other to secure a favorable position in the global hierarchy of prices. However, this competition, couched in terms of the national interest, presupposes the containment of the domestic working classes and the decomposition into productive human factors of production in all national states. Against this background, the role and function of the bourgeois state has been, since its inception, to guarantee and protect bourgeois rights of property. Economic liberals since Adam Smith have argued that the state is indispensable for the provision of the exact administration of justice to resolve clashes of interests. The protection of property, the military defense of its territory, the provision of public goods that are essential for, but cannot be provided by the market, and for facilitating relations of equality and freedom, including the encouragement of competition and therewith of conditions so-called market self-regulation. In the light of this list of state functions, which one of these has been made redundant or forced into retreat by so-called globalization? Of course, the proponents of globalization emphasize the transformation of the state into a hyper-liberal state, and some call for coercive measures to rectify the asymmetry between national democratic systems and capitalist global power in order to reassert liberal democratic values and ensure social justice. Whatever the civilizing effect of such democratic renewals might be able to generate, it would have to guarantee the property rights of capital. This guarantee is the historical justification of liberal democracy. Indeed, none of the proponents of globalization argue otherwise. The proposals then for democratic renewal seeks to make a world a better world without touching the relations of exploitation. This humanizing effort is confronted by the paradox that humanization presupposes inhuman conditions. Can humanization really succeed without the concern for the conditions that rendered humanization necessary? In conclusion, Cox's view that the state is accountable to nebulies personified as the global economy needs to be demystified as a fetishism. The state is not accountable to capital. It is a capitalist state. Further, it makes no sense, as Holloway argues, to see capital as a thing that can be owned. Exchange moved from one place to another, applied in that industry or in another transformed into money, and moved from one country to another. The notion of capital as a thing and of the state as an actor that is accountable to the thing leads to nowhere except the endorsement of invisible principles as the most refined criteria of truth. The attempt to find truth in the invisible and the invincible resists an understanding of our social world as a world made by humans and a world dependent upon human transformative power. However perverted or enlightened this power might be, Cox's notion then of the global economy as a nebulous reinforces the fetishism of capital, yet it goes a long way towards what this chapter has argued. Okay, I'm going to record an outro. I'm going to start doing outros for all these. So, give me feedback on the music, because I'm like a perfectionist. So I actually made this, the music you're hearing, I made this song. I made it with like I used a synth program and the AOA drum presets and some ambient generating VST. So I made a song for this. It's not even a loop. It's just I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I need to figure out the music. I did also make a hour-long breakbeat track I could sample as well, from 2 samples. So I'm gonna probably do that in the next video. And now this book, this is a good book, but it's not like one of those like magnum opus books. So that's why I'm doing this one with like different ways as like an experiment. So if it turns out like just subpar, I can be okay with it. Okay, I can be okay with it. Anyways, some notes from the text is just to summarize the overall argument, because this is a pretty dense article. Capitalism has always been global. It's not a fundamentally national force, because the world market is the basic terrain of accumulation and competition. It's not a secondary layer that's added on top of a separate national economy. The world market disciplines states and workers alike through global competition, forcing governments to maintain conditions profitable for capital by increasing productivity, suppressing labor costs, and protecting private property. This is a decent extrapolation from what Marx is saying in the last section of where he's talking about the Paris Commune, and also kind of the problems of the Soviet Union as well. It was still part of the global economy. Anyways, globalization is not an autonomous force above society, but a social relation rooted in exploitation. Capital cannot exist independently because it always depends on labor to produce surplus value. Modern globalization theory ends up fetishizing markets by treating them as natural uncontrollable powers, when in reality, markets are historically created and politically maintained through states, laws, and class relations, all on a national level. Financial globalization does not abolish the state at all. Instead, the states actively construct and manage global capitalism while competing to attract capital investment and maintain competitiveness. Crises are not accidental disruptions, but built into capitalism itself because they drive to endlessly expand productivity while also reducing living labor, the source of value and profit. So yes, we do believe in the TPRF. Overaccumulation occurs when capital cannot profitably exploit labor at sufficient rates, producing the recurring contradiction of unemployed capital at one pole and unemployed workers at the other. Credit and finance speculation temporarily can postpone crises, by creating claims on future surplus value, but this deepens instability rather than solving capitalism's contradictions. Hence, when the crisis does collapse, it's going to be bigger, and it's going to be blamed on some random things that were done to defer it, but the crisis is always inevitable. There's no, perfect, stable capitalism. The Keynesians are wrong about that one. The idea that neoliberal globalization represents the triumph of the free market over the state is a bit silly. Globalization should be understood as the globalization of labor discipline and capitalist command on a global scale, while on a national scale, this resentment is mediated by the state and by the nation and confined on national levels. Nationalism and appeals to national interests function ideologically to persuade workers to accept austerity, wage restraint, and intensified exploitation in the name of international competitiveness. The national economy is largely political fiction because domestic economies have always existed through the world market rather than independently from it. The national state remains essential under globalization because it guarantees property rights, contract enforcement, labor discipline, and the political conditions necessary for capital accumulation, etc. The relationship between the national and the global is different in unity. States are territorially distinct, but they are structurally integrated moments of a single global capitalist system. Attempts to humanize capitalism through welfare reforms or democratic renewal leave intact the underlying exploitative relation between capital and labor, which is the real source of crisis and domination. And so, capitalism is this contradictory totality that constantly seeks independence from workers while simultaneously depending on their labor for its survival. And as a result, crisis, coercion, and class struggle will remain permanent features of such a system. The next one I'm doing is questions of theory and critique. This one criticizes social theory in general, is the purpose of that one.